Yeah. What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and I am here with the Bo Daddy. Oh, yeah.
Coming to you.
Nerd out?
I am. I was going to say coming to you from the snowy confines of southern Idaho.
Ah. Well, and you may be saying to yourself, if you're like me, like, is that a regular occurrence? It seems like it'd be cold there. It's not, because they got that desert predicament.
That's true. You know, it's funny. I watch the Weather Channel every morning. It's one of my I love it. I don't know why, but I love it. And it's funny to see how much more snow the states around us, like Utah or Wyoming, get. But there's something weird about this high desert of southern Idaho where it avoids a lot of that.
Well, now last week you were recovering from your biking accident.
Well, more of a fishing accident, but yes.
And so now you're just waiting to get off here to go out on the bike in the middle of snow. So
I am. I have a fat bike, and named for the size of its tires, not the person who rides it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's great in snow. So you just let a little bit of the tire pressure out, and then the footprint, because they have such enormous tires, the footprint gives you great traction. It is a joy.
Well, you're gonna go ride in the snow. I'm getting ready for a 17-year-old birthday party.
Oh,
and with some rather specific requests.
Okay. Do you decorate for those, or
we did? And by we, I mean I moved a few big things, and Alicia like set up the playroom for like high school hang area. It looks very youth group room.
Oh,
I'm like, whoa, it's my natural environment. I think Alicia's going to be taking the littles to a movie.
Okay.
I'm making cream tacos, which is like a bunch of you'll see it and you'll say, Trip, I bet your doctor says don't eat this. Right? It's like a cheesy, meaty bean dip. It's like everything you would stick in a taco in the most highly processed form possible, and then you dip chips and stuff in it,
Yeah.
And Elgin wanted me to make a big quiz bowl, because I've done. It's like, Dad's pretty entertaining. He can do a quiz bowl, so we're doing a quiz bowl with a bunch of 17-year-olds.
Oh,
and I got 60 questions that go across all these different things. I had to like research questions about Fortnite. Didn't know a lot for that, but then like how Big Bang Theory, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, Stranger Things, Harry Potter, like that kind of thing. So I'm excited about it. We'll see.
Yeah, deep in the cultural research, huh?
Well, I don't know if I would call Stranger Things deep cultural research, but
you can talk to somebody about Bart and do that kind of research in the same week.
Yeah, I could throw in a couple questions. They were like, what?
Can you imagine?
When did the first edition of Bart's Roma Brief come out and land like a bombshell on the field of early 20th century theology?
Huh? Bart compared.
Is he? He's one of the Simpsons, right?
That was a great impression of a 17-year-old.
Bruh.
Bart compared the event of God's revelation to what natural event?
Compare and contrast the tangential rock imagery of Bart's event to the root imagery of Tillich's event. Like, can we just go to the next one? What 5 characters have held Thor's hammer?
Oh, I don't even know that one.
I know.
Wow.
See, they'll get a point for each one.
Yeah, that's good stuff, man.
I'm not gonna ruin it. I'm sure all those high schoolers at school are watching the live stream just to get ready. They're like, I wonder if Trip's gonna give any hints.
Oh, they're like, Elgin's dad is giving away all the answers.
Yeah. He's just luring them here, so then we can tell them, thoughts about the resurgence of conservative traditional religion among young
Yeah.
generations and really just guide them not to do it.
Hey, do they have any regulations at, that school about using cell phones during
Uh, it
class?
here's they have different rules and levels of enforcement based on the different, um, teachers,
Okay.
and I've Elgin's like, if we're gonna have them, they have to apply to everyone, and they have to be enforced, otherwise, like, if you follow the rule, every one of your friends are sitting around
Yeah.
texting each other, and you just miss out, and you're just he's like,
Oh,
You have to
no.
actually use the rules and have them."
Oh,
But he thinks we should, but, he started taking college classes the first
yeah.
half of the day. He said, "College classes are so much better than high school classes. The teachers,
Oh,
like, think you're supposed to learn something, and,
wow.
you
That's
they can just
interesting.
tell you to leave if you aren't paying attention." In high school,
Wow.
they spend half the time trying to
Trying to, yeah,
Yeah,
corral you in. I have a couple teachers in my life, and, they've been talking lately about the difference some of the schools have, implemented no phones in class, and
yeah,
apparently it just makes a radical difference as far as the teaching goes.
yeah,
And, I hadn't really realized how out of control the problem was. So but it's been interesting, and then I heard, somebody push back and say, like, "No, we just need to." That's not the answer. The answer is to teach them how to use it well.
yeah. It's
And,
like teaching anyway, I that could be a whole episode. I find okay, the assumption underneath that
yeah.
are, like, the worst kind of, like, modern liberal people. This is where modern anthropology,
Yeah.
like, is run rampant. They're still human beings, Bo, that think if you just explain something and give them good
Oh,
reasons and facts, that it actually impacts human decision making. And
yeah.
those are the same people that are like, "We love science." And I'm like, "Have you read psychological science? This isn't how it works." It's just that's just not this just
Huh.
doesn't do it that way. Um, let's say Lori says just as bad in college. One of the perks in in school, at least, is this has been true at all the places I've taught. Though it's been more graduate school than undergrad. Well, even University of Edinburgh, we taught undergrad too. Um, you have some leeway as professors how you set the rules,
Oh.
and I send them with the syllabus a couple articles explaining how much more they will learn if they handwrite all their notes, and that's why there's going to be no phones or computers in the
Huh.
classroom. You just are
Wow.
going to do it by hand. Um, and so it
Yeah.
it and I'm like, but if you can't do that, if you're then just don't come, like
Yeah. That's so interesting. No. When I was
you
a
do get people
professor.
get upset sometimes. And they're like, "Well, what if blah 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 blah?" And
Yeah.
I'm like, "I want you to know I managed to get through school without doing this." So,
Huh.
like, I know it's possible,
Interesting.
And if they're religious, I'm always like Philippians 4:13.
I can do all things through Jesus
You could
Christ,
get through
who
like, you just kinda
strengthens
sit there and you
me.
go, "You're gonna tell me you didn't understand Hegel, and you were playing on the internet while we were reading Hegel and talking about it." Like, I it spent years to moderately understand Hegel,
Yeah.
and it's your first time reading him, and you're going to tweet during it? Like, you deserve to fail. And it's not personal. It's just I don't know anyone who knows Hegel well that was like, "Yeah, I was multitasking." No, you weren't. You weren't learning Hegel. That's what you weren't doing. You probably just asked ChatGPT or whatever about some thoughts about Hegel and then said it. I ask a follow-up question, and then you look at me like,
You know who was terrible at multitasking? Hegel.
"Oh, well." I mean, it's just really hard to hold, um, the logic of all of history in your head, you know? It's a
It
bit
would be.
overwhelming.
It would be.
And I'm just trying to hold just enough about him to not look like an idiot when talking about it. Anyway,
Trip, I do wanna, talk some theology with you today. I have a lot on my mind, and I wanted to give you an update about something, and I wanted to ask you a question. I'm not trying to cut off the banter.
Oh, no, no, no. You texted me your little 1 cents idea. I made I made a bunch of notes not knowing where this is going
Where
to
it's gonna
go.
go.
So
Okay.
we're gonna see what happens. So you kind of set things up.
All right. Before we get to my question, because I really do want to pick your brain. I thought I should update you on something that I find vitally important
Alright.
to my vocation and my existence, and I haven't talked to you about it since, like, 2016, and there's been a pretty big evolution. So,
Okay.
back in 2016, one of the last throwdowns that we recorded, I think, I presented an idea that there are 3 kinds of churches that I primarily find in North America as I interact with people, and I presented them as messianic, therapeutic, and prophetic. And then I said that every primary one had a secondary sort of emphasis and then a neglected. And in the 2 years that followed that, as I presented that idea in seminary classrooms or in churches that I would speak at, I figured out that there was a fatal flaw built into the idea,
Uh-oh.
which is that everyone wants to be all 3. Because that's how we have been taught to think, or that one is better than the other or something. So I sort of let that idea go dormant for a while. And then about a year and a half ago, I resurrected it with a twist that I wanted to present to you. And it's getting a much better hearing. I've presented it twice now, and both times it's been pretty well received.
With the
So
twist.
I've modified it and I said, the
Twist
church.
of lime?
It is a twist of lime,
Okay.
yes. That the church speaks in 3 voices: the messianic, the therapeutic, and the prophetic. And when she is healthy, she does all of those in somewhat of an equal measure. But what I see primarily as I interact with churches is that usually there's one voice that they're well practiced at and prefer. And then there's a secondary one, which sort of is their motivation behind the scenes. And then there's one that they have neglected often. And so what I find is that churches that are messianic, right, that believe in maybe an interventionist God, or who really do believe in, it doesn't necessarily have to be supernatural forces, but definitely a being, right?
You aren't meaning like Walter Benjamin's messianic.
So that's where I got the phrase from, but I don't know that that applies across the board to what I'm trying to address, but it
Mhm.
is where I got the phrase from.
Okay.
But the expectation that the answer to the problem lies beyond, from you, whether you call it the horizon or in a different realm, a heavenly realm, a spiritual realm, that God is the solution. So there is an expectation of, like, whether intercessory prayer or interactive, right, with the divine. But those churches often have a heavy therapeutic component, which is to help you have your best life now, to be well adjusted to an unjust system, to quote Cornel West. But those churches, I find, almost across the board, have no prophetic element to them to speak truth to power. Likewise, I find that therapeutic churches, like many of the mainline and Methodist churches that I'm coming to know better, they often are very comfortable in that therapeutic sense, to help especially young people be good citizens, get into the right schools, or people to, get the right jobs, and right. And they will often have a heart for the prophetic, that their compassion ministries, their justice emphasis, has a prophetic element to it. But I find that those churches might struggle in the realm of actually believing in a God who does something. what I would what I would put in the a more of a messianic, that there's actually like a point to praying because God might do something, act in history. And then I'm learning more about prophetic churches, churches that are good at speaking truth to power, organizing people for change, protesting. And those churches definitely have a messianic component. Let justice roll down. There's definitely a messianic expectation that God cares about this stuff and will help us. But that those churches might not have the strongest connection to a therapeutic element. And that's why so often people get worn down and burnt out and are tired and weary. So the twist is that the church speaks in three voices. When she is at her healthiest, she does them all in appropriate amounts. But primarily because we're in such a fractured state of churches, that we have really gone our separate ways. And a lot of messianic churches don't even know about the prophetic tradition. The closest thing that they have ever encountered is when Barack Obama, his pastor Jeremiah Wright in 2007, got a lot of national attention. And they were like, I didn't even know there were churches. Why would a preacher say, God damn America? And why is it called the Black prophetic tradition? Like, for a lot of people who have a messianic element, they didn't even know there was a prophetic, tradition. And to the therapeutic churches, they really do struggle often with knowing, like, where is God in all of this? Like, can you actually articulate a belief in God, or are you better at defining yourself by what you're not? We're not one of those. We're not like that. And then the prophetic churches, emphasis, um, in need of a therapeutic component so that people don't get worn down and burnt out. What do you think of my twist? My new
I mean, do you remember what I thought last time?
I I don't remember what it was
I think I, like,
specifically.
kinda wanna go listen to it and see what I said.
I know I almost went and did that, but I thought, no, I just want to have the conversation
You just
fresh.
wanted to keep it authentic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, that I think that's fun. I kinda, like, could I think it would be fun to come up with it could be a fun game, Bo, where
Yeah.
you you take whatever the liturgical text is for the week, and then you go, "Okay, well, here if your primary practiced voice is this, and the motivating one's this, and the neglected one's this,
Yeah.
how would it sound?" Now, like, what if you were trying to, in that congregation, lift up the community's motivated voice? How would you preach it? If you're wanting to introduce the neglected one, how would you preach it? Like, you imagine, like, to me, like, there's some, like, fun elements, like, how would you,
Yeah.
if this is how you do the Eucharist, like, is the way we're doing the Eucharist, does it resonate with our deep motivation, or is it
Oh,
communicating this? So,
wow.
one of the things I could imagine being really helpful with it is, I bet leadership of a church, discussing it would pretty quickly, you'd get to go like, "Yeah, this is how we do this."
Yeah.
And so then you might go, "Okay, well, let's say we're therapeutically centered, like, why is that?" Because you give off a vibe,
Yeah.
but oftentimes, at least this has been my experience in mainline places, the how what is the deeply Christian element of that therapeutic impulse? Because a lot of times people relate to it just like,
Yeah.
any other helping
Yeah.
organization or narrative or
Yeah.
whatever. Why is the gospel playing this role? And then, like, that,
Wow.
prophetic side within a
Yeah.
mainline church, like, this has been our deep motivation. Why is it our motivation? Till you lift up the history, like, what does it look like in the past? Like, I think
This
understanding those different voices
Yes.
and then saying, like, Are we really uncomfortable with this?" Like, God doing things? Like, just
Right.
think of how many times, if the I joked one time at church, Bo, that you know that line mainliners like to say, like, God, prayer doesn't change God. Prayer changes me. And I said, every time a mainline Protestant says that, an angel loses their wings.
Oh, no.
And I said it in a sermon and was just like, and in the sermon, okay, again, process people. I feel like this is our witness to the rest of progressive Christianity, is
Yes.
that that they this is kind of important.
Yeah.
And I was preaching basically going,
So
like,
good.
this is the world Jesus describes, like, the form of life he offers his disciples. He says shit like, "When you pray, when you give, when
Yeah.
you," right? And we were doing the Sermon on the Mount, and and the sermon was on the winds. And I said, "It's fascinating that Jesus just presumes we do these things." Right? And then it's telling us, like, how we do it. And
Wow.
when we pray, he doesn't say anything approaching, "Well, prayer changes me." No, he goes, "When you pray, pray this way."
Oh,
Parental
this is
imagery,
so good.
the
Yeah.
kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. All these type
Yeah.
of things. I
Yeah.
said, all these things, it's like the 2/3 of the prayer we love, like forgiveness,
Yeah. Yeah.
working for justice, all this stuff. The whole thing's premised on ultimate reality is oriented towards you, neighbor, and enemy, like a loving parent. That's how it
Wow.
starts. So we pray this way. And I said, that's the part I think we often miss, and we don't understand why. And then I joke about an
Yeah.
angel losing its wings every time a mainline Protestant says,
Trip, that is good stuff.
well,
You
I'll
know
just tell you, Bo, I
Yeah.
got a few more emails on Monday than anticipated. And
Oh, dear
but
Pastor Fuller. Blah, blah, blah.
another one of our clergy says this all the time. And I was like, I'm not saying it doesn't change you. I'm just saying when Jesus says when you
Yeah.
pray, it that was not its primary
That's
focus.
hilarious.
Anyway, it can create some tensions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The other
So
element of this
yeah.
that was I think a lot of times, like, when if you have those out, right, you could see it as a kind of a diagnostic, and then how do we tend to our neglected part? How do we narrate the motivation to the congregation? Like, think of how many mainline churches, the leaders are very motivated by the prophetic side, but then are like, it makes uncomfortable certain people in the congregation, so you
Yeah.
mute it. So, like, how do we
Yeah.
animate that this is our motivation, invite people
Yeah.
in? The other thing is, I think, um, congregations tend to have a temporal orientation. So the very same kind of like way you could deal with the messianic, therapeutic, prophetic, their congregations tend to orient towards the past, right? Could orient towards the now, and then
Okay.
orient towards the future. And so the same kind of arrangement on those, the
Mm,
congregation's orientation um, changes the way it gets expressed.
mm,
And a lot of times the orientation is hooked up into the liturgy, in the broad sense, right? Not like the liturgy, but the
mhm.
liturgy of the church, and thinking about what's missed in those orientations when you overemphasize one orientation towards the other, because like those are like content questions, right? The three elements you picked, and then there's
Mhm.
like the form question of the church is like your orientation towards
Mm,
in the way you relate to temporality. So like prophetic, take for example, um, there are those that will emphasize the prophetic, but it's past oriented
mhm.
versus the present, right, which tends to be more
Right.
liberal Protestants. It's very timely, and then future oriented, which the very same prophetic commitments within a lot of the Black church is more
Mm,
tied to the future.
mm,
This is something you can see, like just tracking,
mhm.
looking at sermons.
Yeah.
I had a student look at analyze apocalyptic preaching for churches all involved in the civil rights movement. And one of the things she pointed out was the orientation towards the future in Black prophetic preaching versus the liberal white Protestant churches that are all at the same marches. But how do they understand the prophetic?
Huh.
Um, anyway, that who knows?
That's
That's just what popped in my head because
yeah. Man, I love that. So I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with a friend of mine, a Mennonite pastor, who heard this idea and decided to take a look at his past 3 sermons and realized that they were entirely prophetic and had no therapeutic component at all. But he's a community organizer, right? He's an activist. And so that's his heart. And so, he was saying, like, as an analytical tool to diagnose where the emphasis is. And so then I started doing that for myself, and I ended up rewriting my Advent sermons because I realized that when it comes to Advent, um, I was lacking a prophetic aspect of it because the sentimentality of the Christmas season meant that I was primarily doing, obviously, messianic because of the narrative stories that the text that we read, and that there was a heavy therapeutic component, especially in these contentious times of family gatherings and political disagreements. But so what I did is I went back and started making sure that there was some element in each one of the lacking voice. And so it's been a really helpful thing for me to try and put into practice. But I like this new wrinkle that you've introduced with the past, present, and future. I think that's gonna take it to the next level, man.
Oh, well,
Yeah, look
you're
at us
welcome. Look at you
leveling
giving
up.
me compliments after you, like, it was your idea. I was just thinking about it.
Well, it
No.
felt very good to run it past you, and specifically because, we historically, we've talked about it before, but that, in the last, what would that be? 2016?
8
Yeah,
years.
so 8 years. I've come a long way with it, and I just think it's a much smoother
Mhm.
presentation that people can digest now, that
Oh,
it's not categorizing them.
it's
It's
like an old-fashioned without the garnish, like, without the
yeah,
orange peel. You're just like, That's not bad, Bo." You put the
yeah,
orange peel on there, and you're
yeah,
like, "Man, this is a
fan.
holiday sipper. Where's the fire at?"
Um, okay, I might come back to a part of this because here's something I could use your help thinking through. Um, I should give you background. I came up in a Christianity that was heavily missional, and contextualization was just sort of built into the understanding that you needed to speak in ways that whatever country you were in, because it was a missionary denomination, or whatever times you were in, because of we did generational ministry, that you needed to speak in ways that were meaningful to people so that they could hear and receive and respond to gospel. Um, did I just drop out? Okay, you were moving something. Um, anyway, so when I went to seminary, I ended up writing my master thesis on contextual theology. And in the years since then, that was 2010 that I wrote that. In the years since then, I have come to know about myself that I do not understand conservative approaches to Christianity. And especially since 2016, not only being a professor at an evangelical seminary, well, 2 of them, and the election of President Trump, I am all the more aware that I don't get the appeal of conservative theology. And especially as I study groups like, radical orthodoxy with its popularity, and even the post-liberal approach that gets called the Yale School, and traditional Catholic people converting as adults, converting to Catholicism. and even post-conservative theology. I study it, but as an outsider, and I'm just very aware that there's nothing like it's so bad, Trip, that whenever I hear the word conservative, because of my cultural theory background, I ask who's being conned and who's being served. And usually the one being conned is the one without power and money, and the one being served is the one with power and money. So I don't even, it's bad. I know it's bad that I'm so cynical. So when I listen to good-hearted people, oh, I'm going to reload my page.
I can hear you fine.
Okay. I won't touch anything.
All right.
When I listen to good-hearted people who are attracted to more conservative brands of Christianity, especially as adult converts, I'm intrigued, but also aware I don't get it. So, Dr. Fuller, can you help me out?
Okay. But so I'm just gonna. This is sad. Like, this is what I did this morning because I knew we were talking about this.
Yes.
So I'm just gonna give you all the bullet points of crap I wrote down, and you can decide whichever interesting. But
fine.
okay, so I was like, what would a sociologist say about our contemporary moment and the attraction of more traditional religion? And then what are the psychological mechanisms that make this attractive? Like, what are the psychological kind of needs that are being met? And because this is what happens when I start thinking about something. I'm like, let me just put what would be the questions or ideas or suggestions that run through my head from different fields. So one of the elements is just like the general search for meaning in our world is problematized by a whole bunch of things. And so every human being has kinds of existential questions. But as the dominant expression of culture becomes more secular, they get refashioned in different ways culturally and also muted. And so the something historic and a community where there are responses to these questions that are often minimized in popular culture is helpful. Another is the frequency of kind of intense religious experience, depth questions, these kinds of things are often deflated in kind of a popular version of disenchantment. So, who is it that takes these things seriously? Another kind of sociological thing is the speed of social acceleration, cultural change is so high. The speed of change, it's like personality spectrum wise, like if you take a big U, the speed of change, the faster the change is, the higher percentage of people feel decentered. So people's kind of personality connected to their genetic inheritance and such, like if you're going 40 miles an hour, oh, that doesn't feel fast. 50, a few more people feel like you're fast, right? So that the cultural changes happening faster means a greater number of people are in a psychological context because of society that triggers the need for something traditional. That also can be triggered by the resistance to modernization in different ways. It could be like at work, questions of efficiency or like new technology and all these kinds of things. I also think we have an epidemic of social isolation. And so knowing how you can belong in a place and more conservative things, like what belonging looks like, is easily described, and you can have a place in it. A place from which you can make criticisms towards kind of hyper individualism or whatever your moral intuitions are. A community that shares that critique it releases the anxiety of feeling like the lone voice, right? And it enables a kind of it also has like a preservation to one's identity. And so religion also a lot of times has to do with like what is a coping mechanism, not in a negative way, but how do you make sense of a lack of, insert all these kinds of things that have been just shared features of most human history. Most human history, you've had like a much more homogenous cultures where the volume of inherited shared values, stories, narratives they're going around, and so more of the individual's now pressed with even more questions they have to address, right? So that could be part of it. Some people want moral clarity. The decline of institutional trust for secular institutions is so high that what's something that came before them. And then you also have like the changing demographics via immigration, as well as the more conservative you are religiously, the higher birth rates you have. So
That's true.
there's just that there. And so like when you think of those sociological questions, and then you think of psychological needs like the need for meaning and purpose, for identity, emotional security, connection, transcendence, some understanding of control and agency, these kinds of things for the individual, or social belonging, shared values, rituals and traditions. This desire for fairness, justice gets where can you have that? Stability, and a collective that has a shared identity. All those kinds of things are hard to get increasingly, and the places that offer them to you seem more and more thin. Then who is it that's going to who are the places that stand with some confidence and declarative sentences offering it, right? So I think some of it is some of it is there are just these sociological, psychological needs for humans, and they aren't being met places. So between kind of technological overload, consumer culture, polarization, climate anxiety that goes around, loss of traditional institutions, these kinds of things generate these deep felt needs, and the number of places that want to speak to them is small, let alone like give answers. And so at least that's my charitable version, Bo, of what might make it attractive.
Thank you.
But you and I naturally are suspicious of the whole framework they give the answers from, right? So we're like, I think sometimes we're like, that's not a good answer. Like that's just wrong. Like that's what goes through my head. But if the answer they're getting, like it comes in the form of an idea or a truth or whatever, but what is really solving a psychological, cultural solution, then maybe we're critiquing it for the wrong side.
That is interesting. I'm really glad that you made that list of things, because I know I'm trying to be generous, right, in my approach, and give a generous reading, if you will, a hermeneutic. And I see my own limitation in that, but in listening to your list, I realized it's because I have found, in my ecclesiology, in my practice of religion and spirituality, in my ecclesial belonging, I don't feel that isolation, that disorientation, right? That So here's what's going on in my brain right now. I'm trying to figure out if it might be the flip side of the coin to the sheer number of people I know who have become nuns and duns. And I'm wondering if those are running on parallel tracks at some level. That it's always thrown me off that people feel like they need to not just find a different community, but they're disillusioned with the idea of religious community altogether. So I'm walking through the list that you just made and thinking, those sound like very similar prompts and responses from people that I know who have walked away from the faith of their upbringing or their church community. It's there's definitely a dissatisfaction that and an agitation. So I'm processing.
So here's something that uh, I mean, I imagine you know this, but sometimes then I will like put on a cap. I'll like pick different thinkers. I'm like, what would this person be thinking about this question? And when you take these kind of parallel trajectories, right? Like if these social, cultural, psychological things are going on, and it generates kind of the the anxiety of the Western moment, right? And you see these different trajectories, but they have their responses to something similar, right? Understanding what they're responding to uh, can be helpful. And someone like Charles Taylor talks about how part of modernity is the development of what he calls the buffered self, where the individual, the modern individual, is increasingly detached from external frameworks like religious or cosmic orders, things that have historically provided meaning in most human cultures since we developed symbolic thought 300 and
Yeah.
some thousand years ago. And so the buffered self, in the modern buffered self versus a porous one, right,
Mhm.
where there is a shared spiritual reality, the buffered self is closed off from transcendent sources of meaning, and that leads to a kind of existential disconnection. So what do you do with it, right? And he talks about this kind of malaise of modernity, where there's he identifies three different kind of modern elements to modernity that generates this spiritual malaise, which he wrote that book near the end of the last century, and it's kind of like dialed up since then. In his newest book, he expands it, but there he points to three things that there's like the increasing individualism, loss of meaning, which is tied to shared narratives and values, and the cultural focus on instrumental reason.
Mhm.
And when you think of what these two groups are doing, right, those that return to some more traditional religious orientation is like, how do I respond to individualism, a community? How do I respond to loss of meaning, the authority of some community that's historic before the cultural moment that generates the problem? And then how do I respond to instrumental reason? This is something you see in post-liberalism, radical orthodoxy, these kind of responses, is to
Mhm.
go
Mhm.
instrumental reason has flattened the world, and the reason you have the emphasis on it is part of the problem. Now, if you take nuns and duns, a lot of them, the instrumental reason bit is the justification for exiting, right? Like, well,
Mhm.
we should just pay attention to the science, or they inherit a kind of more materialist, empirical
Mhm.
worldview. So
Physicalist.
they aren't going to resist the flattening of the world, the loss of meaning. Now, it creates kind of a spiritual entrepreneurship of some sort, right? Like the priesthood of the believer without a priesthood is now you're carrying all the burdens that the individual,
Mm.
in like in early modernity, Protestantism gives to each person the responsibility that used to be the whole church, right? And now do it without the tradition. And so you end up with an explosion of of like kind of explosion of spiritual options, where you have the emergence of all these different spiritual practices from different groups and people. The individual's now left with this task of piecing together a spiritual reality, and so that desire to figure it out and orient yourself, and some of it is like reclaiming past spiritual things that, oh, I'm going to do. I got my Enneagram, my tarot cards. I got, I like this quotes from the Buddha and the follow this Instagram thing. And then I also got into essential oils, or, there's all these different versions
Yeah,
of it.
yeah.
Right. But it's responding to that same crisis, this loss of meaning.
Uh-huh.
And so where's meaning found? Well, beyond the silo of the tradition I came out of. And so to me, there's like, when I think of like those three elements, the individualism, loss of meaning, and instrumental reason, they are parallel in that you can see ways they each are responding to the three, but their solutions are different. Um, and the biggest difference for is the way they would understand authenticity.
Yeah.
right? Like, I mean, in the cultural way, that true self sense. So if you assume the individualism and the finality of one's own reasoning, then authenticity is going to be your own story of self-discovery, and you're the only author of your true self. And then now you look at the other, and they have to recognize the true self that you're authoring in this world, because that's all that you're ever going to get. But then these returns to collectives, the true self is something given by, I mean, in each of
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
collective story, God, or something.
Right. Right.
And it's not something that comes from within, it comes from without, right? But they're both going like, what does it really mean to be me? They're
Yeah.
responding to a world where we don't have
Yeah.
that answer, or we have so many answers. What's the one I can trust?
Man.
But they're both claiming, they're both
Yeah.
wanting to go like, how do I know who I authentically am?
Yeah.
Right. So think of like Russell Brand and his conversion to Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Like it is this, this is what I am authentically. It's discovered. You could think of someone like Jordan Peterson. He's obsessed. Like the question of authenticity then gets expressed with like there. So
Yeah.
there are popular versions, right, of this intuition that at least in the academy shows up in these like schools of thought. But you can see similar moves just in how you respond
Yeah.
to kind of like the crisis of our times.
Oh man, Trip, this is incredibly helpful. I one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to is called Know Your Enemy, and they just have a sort of an ironic approach to subjects like this. They're not theological necessarily, but one of them is an adult convert to Christianity. And during this past year, several times, JD Vance, our new soon-to-be vice president, has come up, and his conversion to Catholicism. And the way that they talk about it has really intrigued me, and that's why I went back and started looking at radical orthodoxy again. And the sort of the starting point for many people in that conversation is just it's the nihilism that seems to permeate modern existence, and the chaos of the world order and so many other things that it is. I don't want to say fear-based, I'm because it's not necessarily that, but it is the cause of concern that initiates their search for something deeper or bigger or beyond. And so it's really helpful to hear you articulate it in that way. And it's funny, as I read Secular Age 15 years ago, but maybe it's time for me to go back and engage that again and wrestle with some Charles Taylor thought.
Well, so here's something that I thought of when I was, after you sent me your thing. I'm actually kind of interested in this. So there's a Byung-Chul Han, the philosopher, engages Taylor Swift, but kind of like, I mean, he has his own vibe here. And one of the things that he raises in this little book on ritual that I found really compelling, but I don't know what I really think about it, because
Okay.
it's like relatively new thought for me. So sometimes I just get so excited about a new idea that
Yeah.
it takes a bit before I've metabolized it of sorts. And he kind of looks at one of the impacts of the modern culture is it generates a burnout society where the subject now, right, as opposed to the burnout society that before, Foucault's looking at us going like, look at you, you're all living in prisons and doing all this,
Yeah.
and like the
Panopticon.
panopticon and all that kind of stuff. He goes, that was earlier in modernity. Now you're your own panopticon. You're walking around. You got to be the achievement subject, like that. He calls them the achievement subjects, like this subjectivity where individuals constantly strive for self-optimization, performance. It leads to exhaustion, anxiety, burnout, and like you are your own torturer, because you've internalized this assumption. And he goes, so like when that's happening, right, where there's this like where the modern subject is the oppressed subject, what are the impacts and elements of human relations that disappear? And so one is the modern world leads to a kind of hyper transparency and a loss of rituals. So things like this
Mm,
desire for deep transparency and efficiency in modern life, what it does, he says, is erode spaces where things like mystery,
mm,
contemplation,
mm.
meaningful communal rituals and such take place. So he's not talking about the veracity of any of them.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
just going, if you like, if you had like a pie chart of parts of your life that have been occupied by the modern economic drive for, efficiency,
Mhm.
growth, this kind of thing,
Productive.
it's kind of kept growing. And more of your life has now been occupied by this logic, so much that
Mm.
there are whole podcasts dedicated to being the most rational and efficient at whatever, like sleep. You know what I mean? Like now
Yeah,
there's like
there's an app for that.
there's a whole app for it. And here's the thing that blew my mind, Mo. I think this is great, but I don't know why I think it's so great, but I think it's cool. So he talks about these that the reason this leads to burnout and things. Think of it. He's even talking about the way our algorithm silos us to things and holds our attention, right? Is the destruction of the other. In that drive for productivity, self-sufficiency, relationships get flattened, and the richness of encountering any other, where there's any tension, resistance, or distance, is lost. And that actually diminishes for your subject the ability to cultivate connection, to have empathy, to engage a world that doesn't any place where you expect there to be tension or resistance isn't there. And when there is, it's your problem. You need to become more efficient. You need to get better. You need to be more successful. And so, people will, and I've seen this, it's created some tension in the home. Why are we all sitting on our own devices, hanging out, watching what we want and
Mhm,
picking what we want? Can't we
mhm.
watch the same thing? I don't want to watch this. I don't want to watch this. Why? Because you can't even have the otherness of watching the same freaking movie. So
Yeah,
and that's one example. But when you think of what happens when you're just sitting there going, can I be in any situation where the other, in any form, right, where there's some demand of like, I have to have empathy, I have to be open, I have to listen, and you aren't expecting the
mm,
reality that's engaging you uh, to just cooperate by fiat, right? That destruction of the other and that loss of ritual side, I think,
hmm,
make sense of this, where this crisis of meaning that comes from the like pressures that neoliberal order brings.
yeah,
It makes you go, oh, we'll be endlessly productive, self-reliant, but it alienates the individual from themselves, because
uh,
now you don't even need a panopticon, like you are doing it to yourself, and then it alienates
mm,
you from others because you're now the taskmaster for yourself, and what you're looking for is the places where you can control the encounter rather than to be, you know, for the other to make demands upon you.
yeah,
Um, anyway, I not, but like that, it's this kind of destruction of the other
yeah.
as a broad category, and obviously religion's one of the places that shows up. But to me, that would make sense, where it's like, who's going to say something about the otherness? And if you go back to I'm pulling up a post-it from my notes of what you
Well, that's
said,
just
but
emerged.
no, but think about this. The messianic thing, right? Like
Yeah,
where you said the messianic element is that uh it's God showing up,
yeah,
the other. Or think of what happens in a church, the other places otherness shows up. Confession of sin, or a community where everyone doesn't hold all the same beliefs and agreements, or like we self-sort in all these places. And then in more mainline liberal places, we we are the ones most likely to cut out language within our liturgy about
it's
even the
true.
otherness of God.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, and so anyway, that's what's there. It's kind of
yeah.
rambly because I didn't know where you're going to
Nope.
go, but that was what
No,
ended up on my
incredibly
notes.
helpful, and it'll allow me to go back and um, write down some of this and engage it, and we can revisit it down the road, because I think it's gonna become an increasingly, relevant topic, especially, I think, in our current political climate, that there's definitely something in the zeitgeist that is, worth addressing, both to try and understand it, but also to account for it and maybe even make some adjustments accordingly, you know? Hey, we had
Mhm.
some comments come in that I wanted to run by you. So
Oh, I was just popping it up. You
oh,
want me?
okay. I didn't even see that one yet.
Oh,
Oh,
well,
there we
then well, I can go
go.
to a
Okay.
different one. What do you want to show?
Oh, I wanted to go well, Noah, his other comment about conservative religious spaces are good at emphasizing the comforting aspects of their doctrine, like a loving all-powerful God who's on your side and afterlife security, over the exclusionary and violent bits. So there is some self-editing, but I think that's true in all traditions and expressions, but definitely, yeah, something there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's saying, yeah, would love to get your take on what the best social alternatives to conservative religion might be. Not sure if my generation will end up back in the pews. Boy, that is, I'm going to think about that. That's a really good
Yeah,
prompt.
here's something it's a sideways answer. But one of the things that Charles Taylor talks about in A Secular Age and even in new book Cosmic Connections is something he calls strong evaluations. And this is when an individual or a community makes some compelling existential, moral, or has a philosophical framework that contrasts with the kind of relativism, individualism, or
Mhm.
nihilism, this kind of thing. And so when you think of strong evaluations, some see those a tradition making them, right?
Okay.
And that's reassuring, right? Like, oh, the tradition that can make some strong evaluative claim, because these are rare in our context. Um, and and so some of the return to religion among younger generations and that conservative I think is like, oh, well, there's a strong evaluation. There's something that is sitting here contrasting with the relativism, individual nihilism that is kind of perceived. There's a statement about what it means to be, say, a man or a human, or like I was thinking of the Theo Bro kind of response. But the other side of it is uh, like more progressive and liberal spaces are just uncomfortable making strong evaluations. Their strong evaluation is against strong evaluations. You know, I
Yeah.
think that's why when you said they tend to ignore the messianic, for progressives, it tends to ignore speaking about God arriving and doing. And so, uh, so there's that side. So like one is maybe part of it is they're willing to say something. And I think the other is culturally, the younger you are, the higher percentage that the assessment for trust is the younger you are, the institutional trust declines and trust in individual influencers goes up, right?
Okay.
So
Yeah.
and there's a
I see
number of
that.
studies that have shown this, both, but you can just look at the data of how they follow things. But you're more likely who do you trust for? You don't get answers like, oh, the church, my
The
church, or
church. Yeah.
whatever. These kind of, you're going to name people, right? So think of even how mainline congregations have a hard time figuring out where you're a Methodist church. Didn't they move a minister to another church, and then a third of them just go to the other one because they weren't a Methodist? They like this. She's a great preacher, and that's why we're moving.
Wow.
And so part of, like, who gets to have a strong evaluation if you don't trust institutions, but the influencers develop a kind of response. Then I think that kind of helps make sense of why someone like Jordan Peterson or Russell Brandon,
Mhm.
this kind of like
Okay.
the question, the people that pop up based on the question you originally raised might be attractive because
Yeah.
um they are making strong evaluations, and
Yeah.
like the way they even engage in it, right, isn't a 18-minute sermon once a week. They hear them talk for hours and
Hours.
hours
Yeah.
every week. And so they develop a trust that in that individual's intuitions and
Huh.
the multiplicity. So when
Yeah.
I think of Noah's question, I think, well, what are the circumstances by which though the younger generations trust someone to make strong evaluations? And baby boomers and older trusted the
Yeah.
institutions that
Right.
passed on democracy, religion, and these kinds of things. But if the culture has shifted
Yeah.
then maybe part of it is, you know,
Yeah.
we still think it's the Christian century and should work that way. So,
Yeah. No, what's interesting is I know so many people who either have what gets called on one end liberal laryngitis, right? When it comes to speaking about divine activity or presence, transcendence, anything in there. But you and I also know a lot of people who have had to cross their fingers behind their backs and sign either doctrinal statements or community conduct agreements in order to teach at seminaries and universities, religious universities.
yeah,
You and I, what?
we're not going to name names, but
No,
there's a few.
right. It's a persistent problem. Yeah, I've a lot of thinking to do. Somebody else asked, and I did notice this too. When listening to the Bonhoeffer podcast, there's a commercial that gets spliced in on some platforms
Mhm.
that is about a film. It's promoting a film that I think is doing something very different with Bonhoeffer.
Where's this quote?
Oh, it's down by 9-person game at
I don't even see it on my list.
8:31.
Oh, well, it depends on the way Megaphone, which does the podcast,
Yeah.
there are ad spots, but each IP address gets different things.
Yeah, yeah.
So, like
Mhm.
they're what do you call them?
I know, I can't think of the phrase,
Like
but I know exactly what you're talking about.
other
Targeted ads.
yeah. So, I clicked on one of Reggie's article on Christian Century about it, and there's an ad for the film on
I saw yeah.
on the article that so it's
yeah.
it's a algorithm thing, so it kind of depends on who you are as to what you get. But
Okay.
I interviewed the director from the film. I think I mean I've talked about this on the podcast quite a few times probably, but I think it's like if you're doing a theology class, you tell me if this makes sense, Bill. You're
Okay.
teaching theology. You got some student who probably they come to divinity schools, intro to theology. They were probably a young life leader,
Mhm.
very passionate and bit naive, right?
Mhm.
And they turn in that final paper, and theoretically it's like a C something. You're like, but you know where they started, and they've made a lot of progress. So you're like, I'm going to give them a B- and a lot of encouraging notes because they've come up with weird
Mhm.
definitions of things like omnipotence that aren't technically omnipotence anymore, but they know they need to keep it, and they mean biblical authority. But they know they also recognized all these other things, and anyway, you see light growth through. You're like, I'm going to give it a B- and lots of encouraging notes. That's what I felt about that film. There are like things of it that are just like,
Is that right?
Yeah, where there's just like wrong. Where I'm like, he didn't drive anyone over the border, like in Operation 7, and anyway, there were some things in it that
Okay.
but he got the he is an
Interesting.
anti-Christian nationalist that that's in the film, and he doesn't like Eric Metaxas. So sometimes when progressive people, and usually it's ones that probably hadn't watched the film, get all worked up, and I'm like, you should probably saying Eric Metaxas helped write the film, and he didn't, and the guy doesn't even like Eric Metaxas' book. The company that bought the film
Sure, yeah.
gives it a
Right.
different title, which is
Oh.
where the spy assassin thing came from.
Okay.
Because those are both bad definitions. Which is literally an entire podcast like the new episode of Rise of Bonhoeffer is like
Is
these are
that right?
myths.
Okay.
That is kind of funny that you would be like,
Yeah.
anyway,
I listened
so
to, like, the first 4, but I haven't listened to the most recent episodes.
well, yeah, so yeah, but so I guess it kind of depends on what the internet thinks your IP address
Yeah.
wants. I keep canceling anytime they try to do ads for online gambling, which I find way more morally problematic than an ad to watch a bad movie.
Right.
But yeah, it was okay. I
Yeah.
mean, it could have been a
Okay.
lot worse. If
Yeah.
if you came in expecting something as bad as I thought, then you're like, oh,
Oh.
he gives he complains about Christian nationalism,
Interesting.
and this is great. But
Yeah, because this comment says, running for a commercial promotion for the new Bonhoeffer film, that such scholars like V. Barnett have opposed so much that they're producing statements protesting the film on account of its misappropriating Bonhoeffer by current forms of Christian nationalism.
yeah, and she's in the episode talking about. I mean, I don't like, and
Okay.
there's a 2-hour conversation with her about this that'll come out soon. So
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. I've talked to Vicky like 7 hours about Bonhoeffer and talked about it. So I
Wow.
don't think I like Vicky a lot, and she's been in the whole series. So I don't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there any other comments that we can touch on? Oh, I like Lori's comment. She said something about, as a ritualist, I see the loss of meaning in that ritual losing meaning over the last 10 years at minimum.
As a ritual, the loss of meaning in ritual, losing meaning over the last 10 years, man. I mean, well, I mean, I think at least the way I hear it, it could be the way rituals, the way rituals function are much like symbols. They live and die, and they transform in different contexts. So that could be part of it. I don't know what. I do know that the frequency of ritualistic elements of Christian worship has grown in most denominations that track it, right?
Oh,
So,
that's
like
so
the
interesting.
number of churches where you aren't required to have Eucharist every week that do
Yeah.
has
Yeah.
gone up over the last 30 years. The um the surveys on like when you're searching for churches that those
Yeah.
kind of things are uh
Oh,
like
that's so interesting.
people searching for churches. Oh, these kind of ritualistic elements.
Hmm.
Um, the number of churches that use things like the Lord's Prayer have also gone up. Like, obviously some church liturgies have it
No.
in all the time, but when you
Yeah.
think of that, the percentage of like when we were in youth group,
Yeah.
evangelicals didn't know what Lent and Advent
No,
was,
I didn't.
and now
Yeah.
it's a part of it in so many more
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah.
spaces. Uh, but the one of the things rituals I think enable um is a legitimation for what people yearn for when they don't have the confidence to say it themselves, right? So,
Huh.
take it, say I'm like, I don't know what the hell's going on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's like, no, Gregory of Nyssa wrote the prayer, so I can at least say this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know
Oh,
what
man.
words to use,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of uncomfortable with it, so it's there. Or um, you do your best in a sermon, you're trying to be honest about where you are and the text and the community and all this
Yeah.
kind of thing, but when it goes to serving the Eucharist, you're like, "No, this is the body," like,
Mhm.
and it makes a space where rituals in many ways kind of sees these very conditioned finite things like language and these kinds of stuff
Yeah.
and go, um, it's like when we go, there is a depth, but you're not saying there is a depth dimension on your own. You're going like, no, actually, there's 2 billion people on the planet who've had someone put them in water or splash them with water and say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit,
Yeah.
or have heard your sins are forgiven, or
Yeah.
the instantiation of the Eucharist, and these kinds of things. And so the ritual space, I think, gives it's kind of like a distancing maneuver from that inherently critical, reflective. Let me negotiate how I do this, but like to do a ritual, you do it, and so you
Yeah.
kind of like jump in. Um, at least that's what I'm thinking is the response stuff. There's uh of why it's attractive, and has had like a growth
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
even the use in some of these more modern Protestant denominations that de-ritualize, right,
So
all the way to something like Saddleback. Now you
yeah.
see
Yeah.
even in some of those churches, the frequency of Eucharist, these historic
Wow.
things showing back up.
What an interesting development. Because, for me, the heart for ritualistic practices is to make them living, um, ceremonies, uh, right? In the best sense of the ritualistic. And one of the things you look to avoid is for them to become dead, rote, robotic, right? Meaningless. And so I'm very aware that when I left evangelicalism, right, in that, say, 2010 window, um, that ritual and practice was still pretty absent from most of our gatherings, but that I was starting to see in like college and career groups, a desire for that and a re-engagement of that. It's one of the things about the emergent approach that really intrigued me. But then obviously when I came over to being United Methodist, I had the opposite thing on my hand, which is that everyone knew what to do, but they didn't necessarily know what it meant or why we did it. And so to try and breathe life into that. And so it was repetition, but with variation. And so in that sense, not everyone thinks I'm a very good Methodist or mainline pastor because I do repetition with variation. I'm very leery of repetition with no variation. That just there's something feels very dead about that to me. And so, like, for instance, even in our rotation, normally we take communion the first Sunday of the month, but I don't take communion in December. We don't do celebrate the table because the imagery around Advent, the Advent sort of thematic and aesthetic, um, for me, lends itself to giving rest or a Sabbath from, communion, but I know that for a lot of people, that bugs them, and they don't appreciate that very much, but for me, there's, like, a theological conviction behind it.
Mhm. It one other thing that just popped in my head, and this came up when doing all the interviews and stuff for the Emerged
Yeah.
podcast, is there were multiple of the emerging church planners that talked about, um, another element of the return to ritual. Like, some thought, "Oh, this is we're leading with this," right? Where you take s the where the ancient future whole church conversation things there. Others were like, "Well, eventually you get tired of reinventing the wheel every week."
Yeah, yeah.
And
I've
I
heard
can't
this.
remember who said this, but it was something like, "Well, once the culture of the church is all these things we've been creating every week, we're
Yeah.
relating to them with a kind of intentionality that's different than, um, our previous church experience, or if they came in and didn't come from church context where there's this intentionality of the liturgy, then you introduce the same liturgy you could have done 5 years ago. And because the culture's different,
Yeah,
now the tradition vibes in a very different way. Like, it comes to resonate just like when you had a poetry group
yeah,
construct everything for Advent. And so the like, I wonder how much of
yeah,
the return to some of the more ancient things and is this, like, because it's from people that didn't grow up in it. Like, I have to culturally commute into this new
yep,
space, and so now I'm showing up and I'm taking it seriously, right? Like, adult converts to a liturgical tradition are way more into it than if
yeah,
you grew up in it. You're
that
like,
is
"Oh
true,
god, here we go.
that
I
is
mean,
true.
oh, we gotta stand up,"
Yeah,
and then the adult converts are like, "Oh, they're gonna carry the scripture out now," you know,
the procession.
and like, they get all and so
Uh,
like, I wonder how much of that
yeah,
when I heard that described, and I wish I knew who that was that said it. It was like, once the culture has this intentionality to it, then the ritual, the depth of the ritual and stuff can function more.
huh,
Um, and so it's kind of like the Heideggerian mood. What's the mood of the liturgy versus the actual
mhm,
uh, liturgy itself? And part of what's happened, I think, in therapeutic spaces, the mood is for therapeutic orientation. Then I don't need to. I'm just gonna kind of chill out. But if it's a messianic mood, to your liturgy, the very same liturgy hits different, right? So what's the um, What's the mood? Thinking back to the beginning, like you could think, what is the mood
Yeah.
of a service
Yeah.
that prioritizes one?
Right. Yeah. What's the voice and the timbre?
Mhm.
Lori, to answer your question, she asked if I told them that about communion. So it's a yes and no answer. I did tell them, but in November, when we were coming to the table, I explained that this would be the last time that we did it this year because, but I didn't do it in Advent. I did it a month before that. So maybe I should have mentioned something that Sunday because, not everybody's there every week.
Really?
No, it's church attendance patterns are really interesting, man. Generationally, but also regionally.
Yeah. And then sometimes, uh, sports calendar.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Not
That
just
is
your
very true.
kids. Uh, the, um at least in LA, I knew that if we
I
had East Coast games of certain schools, or teams, it would impact attendance.
That is funny. Um, Speaking of LA, one of the things that I was reflecting on that made me smile is uh around here, because people are from here, they leave to go to other places because there's no university here, so people often move away and they maybe come back later, but they definitely visit for the holidays. So in that sense, the traditional expectation that Christmas Eve is a really big service. And I'll never forget our first couple years of doing the Loft LA, when we figured out that our first 2 weeks of Advent were gonna be our biggest services, and then people were gonna start migrating back home, and that we ended up not even doing a Christmas Eve service. We combined with the cathedral worship in the sanctuary because we wouldn't even have enough people to facilitate a Christmas Eve service, so everyone was gonna go back home for the holiday because everybody in LA is, a migrant. They're from someplace else. And,
Yeah.
just
And
funny
then,
stuff
like,
like
all
that.
these people that never come show up at Christmas Eve, where
It's true,
it's like
like,
all these people may have grown up there, or they're,
yeah,
like, visiting
yeah,
their grandparents,
yeah.
and they're doing something. That's like when we switched. I got, everyone to switch where you didn't have assigned parts, for the nativity stuff. It was like a
Yeah?
kind of like family improv one, so if you
Oh,
came and you didn't have
interesting.
to be there,
Yeah.
we had it all kinda worked out where our
Oh, that's
volunteers,
fun.
like, you didn't have to, it wasn't like you practiced, it just kinda happened.
Yeah.
And the big plan thing's the second week of Advent, where we do the big Christmas thing, and
Yeah, that's fun.
people start lobbying for their parts 6 months in advance. "I wanna be the rock angel." And you're
Oh,
like,
yeah. Is that's the hot roll?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. It was it was intense. We'd bring in real animals and junk, Bo. Them
Wow.
them shepherds would little kids wanted to be the shepherds because then you got to,
Sure.
"I hang out with the sheep and llamas."
Wow, man. That's cool. Yeah, it's fun, when you move different places, especially regionally, and you see the differences, and especially in expectations, but also in, um, memories. You get to hear great stories about things that people remember from years gone by, and man, it's just like even that, like, think about bringing in live animals and what kind of an undertaking that would be. It's pretty wild.
Yeah. Yeah, it was the high schoolers did the scene in the called Herod's Court,
Oh.
and, which led to, the guys would be in these centurion outfits and this
Oh,
kind of thing, and the
no.
girls would be in, like, belly dancer outfits, like a like
Yeah.
Jasmine from Aladdin, and the first year I'm there, right, and I don't know what's going on, and I'm in my head, I'm just thinking, D almost every youth group I'd ever been a part of, you couldn't even wear this at a youth event, they
No.
would've been like, "You're gonna have to wear a t-shirt over that two-piece," and there's just like there's all in them, and one, like, it's Christmas, so if you're in, like, a place with seasons, you're not walking around and almost no clothes, but in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
you could have
Wow.
your midriff out on Christmas, so they're just like, "Yeah, well, it's Herod's Court," and because you have so many people from the film industry, the sets and the pieces and stuff are, like, this is not just some your average volunteers. You're like, whoa, some
Hey, Trip, are we going to record one more time before Christmas?
yeah. I like talking to you, Bill. It's not very hard.
Oh, all right. Because you know what I would love to talk with you about is not just incarnation as a concept, but about the importance of embodiment
Okay.
and bodies specifically, lived experience and enfleshment. I have a couple I have a couple things that have really been inspiring me lately, and I'd love to chat with you about it.
Okay. Or is that all the warning I'm gonna get, or are you wanna tell me more about it?
I can send you
Okay, you can text me more.
I will
I
send you
never know.
more. No, no. Sometimes I like to keep it minimalist so that in real time, like our reactions are spontaneous and your word authentic.
Yeah. Well, I had a 48-hour heads up. All I had was a half a sentence. You haven't even got all my complaints about radical orthodoxy and post
No.
liberalism because you said I didn't know where we were all going to go here, and
Interesting.
I, Bo, sometimes I can vent,
Yeah,
but it's
I've
probably
been
good.
there.
It'll ruin the Christmas cheer if I started venting. Next time I'll be like, let's get fleshy,
All right.
and we bring a lot of flesh to the yard.
Yeah, that's true. I was gonna make no. I was gonna make I take
The
long showers.
both
I
self
take
edits.
I take long showers, and sometimes people question that, and I just say, "Look, it's a surface area issue."
It's a surface area.
If you prorate it by surface area, it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Well, yeah. Well, you're gonna text me then, so
I
we can
will.
come up with a fun title for it, and then,
Yeah.
um, but now I'm gonna go clean toilets and prepare a
Oh,
bunch of stuff for a
ahead of
birthday
the
party.
party.
Yeah,
A house is never cleaner than right before a party.
but okay, I have not brought this up, but like a birthday party with high
Yeah.
school boys, a large number of high school boys. Why am I cleaning the toilets
Right.
before?
Clean them after.
That's what I thought. Not. I mean, I thought that,
Yeah.
but
Mm. You know, it's not a hill to die on, really.
should I go put a sign over the toilets that says, "In this house, we sit down"?
We're one of those houses.
Yeah. When I went to Doug Padgett's house, um, he said it like that. He was just like, "I'm going to the bathroom," I was like, "Oh, I need to use the restroom." He goes, In our house, we sit down."
He said that?
Yeah. And I was like, How many people do you think, uh, feel comfortable just saying that to anyone that walks in their house for the first time?" Doug Padgett would be on my list of people that would say it,
Yeah,
but he's like,
it's pretty funny.
"Yeah."
A sentence I've never uttered, so